Everyone. I'm Eric Snyder with Ignite 360, and I'm here with Rob Volpe, Ignite 360 CEO.
Hello. Hi.
Hello, Rob, and hello, everyone. We're glad to have you here with us today. Thanks for joining us. If you're here to find out more as to why empathy is critical within the workplace, and then possibly how to apply the aspects of empathy in your workplace with better customer care, improved internal work relationships, or increasing your company's sales, you've come to the right place. You can chat with us by asking questions. To do that, simply click on chat in the upper right corner and select all panelists. Again, if you'd like to ask us a question, simply click on chat in the upper right corner and select all panelists. Your questions will only be seen by us. Here's something we'd like to learn right away. If you're in a room right now with multiple folks viewing us on screen, would you let us know how many are in your room? Again, click chat, all panelists, and Rob and I are going to go behind the curtain. Here are some surprising truth headlines for today. Would you sign up to learn how to grow your business by 60%? We will show you how. One company did just that by increasing their sales by 60% with a focus on empathy. It's what we call ROE, or return on empathy. And with empathy skills down 40% among folks under 37, are you here to find ways to develop empathy skills and apply them to growing your business? By the end of our time together, you will learn why empathy is critical, have a clear understanding of the 5 steps to build empathy, and apply them in your workspace. So let's find out more. As I mentioned, Rob Volpe is here with me today, and Rob is joining us from San Francisco, and I'm here in Phoenix.
Hello, Eric.
Hello again, Rob. And it's winding down from a hot summer, by the way, just so you know. And starting earlier this year, we here at Ignite 360 unveiled a new direction for the company. We have been cited over and over again, which is kind of nice, and clients have come to know us and in many cases rely upon us for our empathy work in what we do every day. So we thought, why not share our expertise and add or pass along that empathy dimension for you to use in your roles. We call it Empathy Camp. Our Empathy Camp is about uncovering that surprising truth about empathy and how empathy has a key role in the decisions you make and the critical thinking you apply to your job. To get us going, we have a plan for our time together today. We will spend 45 minutes or so on our orientation, and then we'll leave 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A at the end. We're introducing empathy, and we'll now get into the practical knowledge and skills followed by taking it further, and then we'll get into our Q&A. So first off, we think it's really vital that we're all using the same definition of empathy. We hear about empathy a lot, and to have us all with the same definition, one that we want to showcase here, it's about sharing someone else's experience. Oftentimes, empathy is either confused with sympathy or thought to be the same. And when it gets down to it, they are different. And one way to think about them, it's the difference between 3 and 4 letters. Sympathy is the ability to feel for a person, while empathy is the ability to feel with a person. So see that difference between for and with. For some companies, being able to empathize can mean the difference of not understanding or not knowing their customer. Once an empathy shift takes place, it can mean growing a business. For those of you who have delved more into empathy, we are focusing on cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is a conscious endeavor to recognize accurately and understand another's emotional state or point of view. There is also affective empathy, or where we respond to another person's emotions. For today, we are talking about cognitive empathy. Rob, why don't you come back in and join us now?
All right, thank you. So for everybody, hopefully you heard Eric's directions at the beginning. We've got a flash question for you. I want you to share first thing that pops into your head. Don't overthink this, but I want you to answer this question. You can message us through the chat feature to all panelists, and just tell us first thing that pops into your head. What is a situation or problem that empathy could help solve in your workplace? So what's a situation or problem that empathy could help to solve in your workplace? And just use the chat feature to all panelists. And again, first thing that pops into your head, no wrong answers.
So the first couple of things that we're hearing about, Rob, is feeling like your work is not appreciated, workplace conflict, change, long commute to work impacting health, which equals stress.
Awesome. Those are all excellent, and all things that empathy plays into, and whether it's how we're relating to our coworkers, whether it's how we're relating to, perhaps it's our manager, to the question of not feeling our managers relating to us in terms of our work being appreciated or seen or recognized. And I would imagine, I've had some really long commutes in my work history. I can imagine that it is stressful, and you don't leave your emotions in the car or at home. You bring them in with you, and empathy is part of that. And if you're in a stressful situation, how are you actually able to build empathy with other people? All awesome. Thank you guys for sharing that. We will start to address some of this as we're going through, and we're certainly available at the Q&A at the end as well. So think about questions that you might have as we're going through, jot them down on a Post-it note or in your notebook, and please feel comfortable asking questions. We keep everything anonymous, but definitely want to have the conversation as it goes. So as Eric mentioned, there's a 40% decline in empathy skills, and that's among people under 37. And I'll talk about where that number comes from in a minute. That empathy deficit, regardless of our age, though, is affecting many of us. I love this photo. It might look familiar to you. It might have happened at your breakfast table this morning, could have happened at lunch, might be happening at dinner tonight. It's two people sitting together, yet alone. They're looking into their devices instead of being together and interacting and talking to each other and sharing. And how, I might ask, are you able to see another person's point of view if you're not engaging directly with them, if you're down looking into your phone? The answer is you really can't. And seeing that other person's perspective, that's the empathy that we're talking about. Another photo. I've seen this version played out several times. I've seen it at music concerts. I've seen it, and you go and look on social media at any of your friends that have been to a concert, and you see tons of little screens being held up as everybody's using their phone to record some, whether it's a short video or taking a picture of the artist that's up on stage. I've also seen this at sporting events. I've even seen this at art exhibits when people are spending more time looking through their phone and seeing the world through that secondary lens rather than taking everything in with their own eyes. And by doing that, that's creating distance, and that distance diminishes our perspective. So because suddenly, you know, the shortest point between two objects is a straight line, well, you've added a third point that has to reflect and refract what you're actually seeing. The only person in this photo you might notice in the lower left, there's that one woman. She is present. She is in the activity. She's seeing it. She's hearing it. She's smelling and feeling. She's right there in the moment. She is building a more direct connection, more empathy, because she's present. She's there. She's really taking it in with her own eyes, with all of her senses. She's listening, and she's able to understand. So what's behind this? And I talked about the 40% less empathy. I will reveal where that number has come from and the study that's behind it. But the cause of the crisis, you have probably heard within the last year about the bubble that we all are living in. Regardless of which side you're on, each one of us is in our own bubble. And that's from our communities to our circles of friends, our friendship circles online. And that even extends into our places of work and worship. Each one of those is a bubble. And even if you think about, if you're working in a large corporation, you've got a few different bubbles that you're in as well. It might be the business unit that you're in. It might be the function that you work in. It could be the cross-functional team or the project team that you work on. Lots of different bubbles that we end up putting ourselves into. And sometimes those bubble walls become really solid. And that means that we're not able to really see or listen. And that means we're not hearing what is happening outside of our bubble. That is then serving to reinforce our beliefs, and it further diminishes our empathy for understanding other people's point of view. So that 40% number came from a University of Michigan study. It was published in 2010, and they did a meta-analysis. They looked at college student surveys from 1979 all the way through 2009. And they found, starting in 2001, there was a 40% decline in empathy compared to previous decades. And the question that they were looking at was about whether students were able to see the perspective of their classmates and their peers. Were they able to have that cognitive empathy? And the point they actually weren't. There was a 40% decline, and that has not changed. Those seniors now, if you think about it, and this is where I start to get concerned, if you were a college senior in 2001, let's say you were 21 years old, and now here we are 16 years later, that means you're well into your career, you're in your mid-30s, and so you have taken that empathy deficit with you, because it doesn't just stay, you didn't leave it on the college campus, it wasn't what you threw up in the air at graduation, you brought that with you. And so now you're well into your career and in the workforce. And it's not that you're a bad person or anything like that. You're not intentionally not using empathy, but you're not intentionally using empathy. So it's not that you're intentionally not using empathy, but the awareness isn't there to actually use it. And that's part of what we're helping bring forward. And so what was causing that decline? The authors of the Michigan study hypothesized, and we tend to agree, that there's a few different factors going into it. A lot of self-directed media. So think about video games. When you're playing a video game, you might even have a friend over, but you're actually playing with the device against a screen rather than actually playing like you would a board game across the table from a friend, where you would be interacting in a very different fashion. A lot of media is self-directed. A lot of solitary interaction. You think about boredom, and where do we go when we get bored? If you're in the checkout line at the supermarket, or maybe you're waiting in some other line, what do? Most likely you pull out your cell phone and take a look, rather than striking up a conversation or observing what's happening around you. So that's also another way. We're not allowing ourselves to be bored, we're filling our time. So it's limiting our opportunities to really pay attention and connect and learn about the people and the situations that are around us. Kids, I'm old enough to remember back in the mid-90s, kids were starting to get overscheduled, and you started to hear more and more about that. And they were going from activity to activity, never having that time to be bored. And it's when they're bored that our minds drift, and that's when we get creative. That's when a kid might end up role-playing their favorite superhero, or the Wild West, or whatever other role-play fantasy they come up with. And that stepping into the shoes of somebody else through that role-playing, that's a very early developer of empathy and empathy skills. So we're not allowing ourselves to be bored. We've got self-directed media. All of that's coming together and creating a distracted society that doesn't really have as much empathy as they used to. Now, this also extends into the workplace. This is another photo. Looks familiar. It might have happened at your office today, or be on the lookout for it later today. Before a meeting starts, what happens? People pull out their devices, check their email or Facebook, or perhaps they text or do something else. Everything other than making small talk with their colleagues who are also sitting there. There's limited amounts of small talk, and even if there is small talk, what we witness when we're on site with all of our different clients, the small talk is really distracted because somebody's got their face in a screen and they're doing something else. That's not actually paying full attention. So you're not able to actually be present and be in the moment and be that older woman that we showed in that photo earlier at whatever that event was. And it's that small talk that, how was your weekend? What are your plans for tonight? Did you see that TV show? All of those small interactions are what help us connect with one another. And by connecting with each other, that's where we start to learn about people's perspective, and we start to understand their point of view, where they're coming from, and that's what empathy is all about. And that's the foundation of empathy. As I mentioned earlier, empathy is like one of your senses. It's a skill that humans are actually born able to do. So it's kind of bullshit, pardon my French, that anybody would say, oh, I can't be empathetic. I don't have it. I wasn't born with it. That's a load of crap. They actually have it, particularly cognitive empathy. They just need to practice working with it. And as I said, it's a skill that we're born with, and it's something that you don't just leave at home. Like the stress that builds up while you're commuting into work, you bring all of your feelings, your emotions, you bring your empathy skills, you bring all of your senses into the workplace. It's not that you're like, oh, hey, I'm going to leave my sense of smell at home today and go into work otherwise not able to smell anything. Very similarly, empathy, you don't leave it at home. You bring it with you. You got it all the time. You just need to be able to remember to use the skills to help build and develop empathy and apply it at work. And that's part of what we're talking about today. So if you're not able to empathize, it hinders our ability to collaborate, to problem solve, to make decisions, and understand others. And it sounds like a lot of the comments you guys shared with us on that first question all start to fall into that bucket. All of those things have an impact on the bottom line. If you're not able to empathize, it hurts our ability to collaborate, to problem solve, making those decisions. And beyond our immediate colleagues, empathy is what allows us to really connect with our customers. If any of you are in sales or any sort of an outward-facing role where you're dealing with consumers, customers, clients, however you want to refer to them, empathy is what allows you to really connect with them and build a relationship. And that relationship is what fuels your ultimate success as a company. Empathy is also the foundation for insights, as well as the fuel for innovation. I know we've got some folks here that are in the insights profession, and it's an area that we have a lot of experience in. And the way we think about empathy is the foundation. It's the 360. It's the understanding of who a consumer is. And then if you start to think about building a pyramid, you have an insight that sits on top of that. So the empathy that you build helps you understand and connect and relate to the insight. The insight, then, on top of that, you have the actual action step, or the recommendation, or the solution, where you're going to go from there. So empathy is really the foundation. It's the base of a pyramid on which insights rests, and then action can flourish on top of that. You might actually think about times in your own company when you've had misunderstandings. Perhaps there's been some team dysfunction, a work team isn't getting along, they're not connecting with each other. That's typically because of empathy and limited perspective taking. They weren't taking the time to understand somebody else's perspective. I was recently having lunch with a VP at a major CPG, and that individual was telling me about some of the managers that were on their team. And one of the managers, this VP told me, would work with the cross-functional team and say, that's a terrible idea. I don't like that. So now, if you're working on that team, how motivated are you going to be? Not particularly. And so it's creating a sense of dysfunction and chaos on the team because it needs to be this manager's way or the highway, rather than the manager taking some time to practice some empathy, understand the point of view of the other people on the team. Where are they coming from? What's that idea all about? It's limiting their effectiveness. And so with all of these stories, you start to question, how can a business thrive if empathy is limited between colleagues as well as with customers? Being able to take the perspective of others in the workplace actually isn't anything new. One leader long ago recognized the importance of empathy. And looking at this photo, you might be able to guess who it is.
Is it your car, Rob?
It's my car, yes. It's one of a collection. No, it is not mine, but it is Henry Ford's production line. And he shared this quote. And when I found this quote, I fell in love with it because I was like, yes, this is it. This is what this is about, as empathy relates to business. And Henry Ford is known for saying, if there is any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own. Success lies in the ability to get the other person's point of view and see things from that person's angle as well as from your own. So what he's talking about is just integrating that. It's taking the time to get to know how somebody else is thinking about something and seeing it from their perspective and understanding that, as well as integrating it into your own. And so understanding how that comes together. How can you compromise? How can you reach a working decision that will solve the problem, meet the needs of everybody that's there? We've got a couple of examples now that we want to share where seeing another person's point of view has turned into some great business successes. Some of you might remember when cell phones looked like this. There was an external antenna, perhaps it was a flip phone, lots of wires and knobs protruding, was not the sleek, beautiful iPhone and similar Samsung designs that we have on the market now. One of the cell phone manufacturers, back in the day when there were just the wireless or extendable antennas, one of the cell phone manufacturers was a product marketer who had an idea to create an internal antenna. Imagine what it could be like. What could the world be like if the antenna did not have to protrude? You didn't have to pull the antenna out in order to get better reception. No more lost calls as you're walking across the street. No more broken antennas. I know I've bent a few in my day. But achieving that was, while from a marketing perspective, it's going to give a sleeker design. They could do a lot more with the appearance of the phone. However, the engineers needed to find the space inside, needed to figure out how to make that work. And they weren't necessarily willing because this was working well. There were no issues with this. It's what they knew and what they understood. So the product marketer needed to get the engineers on board. And so if you've worked on a cross-functional team, you know that that's easier said than done in some cases. Collaboration means working together, and to do that, you have to have empathy. So this particular product manager, he knew the engineers weren't going to be motivated by just the external beauty of the design. They're not excited by the things that excite the marketers. And so there was some pushback, and they were just like, oh, that can't be done. So what the product manager did, he came back and he started to understand the point of view of the engineers and what they were motivated by, and focused instead on what could be done that would excite the engineers, and how could they internally incorporate an antenna and make space for it, and what was once on the outside, put it onto the inside. And those challenges that engineers get excited about. Where does the space come from? How can they make room? The product manager approached the engineers. He approached them from their perspective, however, and he gave them a challenge that spoke to them. Create the internal antenna, and he used the engineering perspective. I won't go into all of the detail because I'm guessing most of us are not cell phone engineers or mechanical engineers. So approach it from an engineering perspective rather than from a marketing perspective. And this actually worked. Together, the team was able to launch a new phone, and it was the first of its kind with an internal antenna. And this is the phone that they came out with. And Samsung sold 10 million units of this one single model phone, and it shifted the entire industry toward internal antennas. And that's just one example of how empathy in the workplace, taking the perspective of your cross-functional team members, can really lead to a big impact on the bottom line. Got another example for you, and this one is more of a marketing example. Ask yourself this question about beauty. How do you think about beauty before the last turn of the century? And you get the stereotypical answer: models on catwalks, cover girls, stereotypes of what women are supposed to look like according to a standard that is not necessarily practical. But one company and their advertising communication team set out to understand how women really consider beauty. And they took the time to listen without judgment to women's stories. And that ended up inspiring a campaign that challenged the stereotypes and instead presented ideals of real beauty. So empathy with women on the topic of beauty created a point of difference, and it enabled a huge sales growth of 60% over 10 years. That is, and you probably recognized the photo of the women. I think this was from one of the earlier launch campaigns. Dove Real Beauty campaign, their sales grew from $2.5 billion to $4 billion over 10 years. And Dove continues and remains grounded in that original empathic message. They took the time to understand what the consumer was all about. They took the time to understand the perspective, the point of view of real women, and then they developed an insight around that, understood how it could impact their communication. They had a sharp differentiation that empowered all of their marketing. And now, over 10 years later, they're continuing to run the Real Beauty campaign and continuing to see huge business growth from that.
So Rob, taking this a step further, we think of empathy as a muscle. Just as we have biceps that we train to build, so is empathy a muscle that we want to build. It takes practice and time to train, to define and refine that muscle, just as you might do with your biceps. Just as we might go to the gym to train that muscle, so too is training a part of building your empathy muscle. So with that, drum roll please. We want to introduce you to 5 steps to take in building your empathy muscle. The first one is dismantle judgment. Put aside your personal bias or thinking. The second one is asking or ask good questions. This is where you start to begin to understand. This is not about asking leading questions. It's about asking questions from a place of curiosity and inquisitiveness, keeping a blank slate in mind and staying open to what you hear. This is where true learning can take place. Third is to actively listen, to acknowledge what you're hearing, listen, asking more questions, all while being very cognizant of what you see. So it's the verbal and the nonverbals as well. Fourth is integrating what you understand. So that's taking what you've heard, building a story of what you've heard, or maybe what we've all heard. Fifth is to use what we're calling solution imagination. This is applying that story in a guided process with tools to begin to put your work into action. Today, for our time together, we are going to focus on the first two, dismantle judgment and ask good questions. So let's start off with dismantle judgment. In order to put on someone else's shoes, we have to take off our own shoes. These often are judgments that sit below the surface. So we need to make a conscious effort to be aware and dismantle judgment when we see it. Some of those judgments might be a confirmation bias, where we seek to hear and make things fit into what we already know. Okay, and freely admit here, I'm guilty of this one. And I'm sure some other people might agree with me on this. I know what I'm trying to get across, so I validate information by making sure people tell me what I want to hear. I make sure to ask the questions that will lead me to get the right answer from them, or I discard information that doesn't fit. You quickly see how judgments pop up unconsciously for us. Another might be projection bias, where we project what we want to hear. Sounds almost like confirmation bias, but here we almost give them the words we want them to say again by leading them with questions to take them to the place where we want them to go. Another is cognitive dissonance. You may have been stopped on the street with a request to sign a petition to save the whales. I'm really not into whales, so my judgment takes over before I even hear what they may have to say. I'm going to guess here that you might be nodding in agreement with some of these. It's almost hard to admit we make these judgments. If you layer in stereotypes and past experiences to other forms of judgment, you quickly see we are one big judgment machine. The point here is to be aware of these judgments. You're not going to stop judging because that's a part of who we are. But when we are aware of them and how they impact our ability to be open and listen without the judgment chatter, that's where it can make a difference. So remember, we're all human and we all do it. The awareness is the big part here. So let's just see how those judgments play out. So look at this woman on the left here. As a model, and by applying what I'm going to do in air quotes, model standards, would we have seen this gorgeous woman as flawed? These standards influence our responses, resulting in unconscious judgment yet again. So this happens in an instant. You're probably realizing that right now without thinking about it. So is she flawed or flawless? Left up to wherever our judgment takes us will give us an answer. We want to acknowledge that we all judge, as I said before. It's in our nature no matter what. But once we're aware, we want to hit pause on those judgments to better understand what's going on. I'm not suggesting taking away, maybe just hit pause. You see how judgment can build a wall, and you probably, as you're thinking about it right now, can recall times where it is a barrier. Pausing keeps us open and more accepting. That's when we can see below the surface and perhaps more than what we first realized. Let's see how this plays out. We've got an exercise for you. Write down the first number that comes to mind when you hear, "I'll get back to you in a minute."
No.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Oh my gosh.
60 seconds comes to my mind. 1 minute.
I'm doing it right now. What is it? That's so funny. See, it's so natural. Write down the first number that comes to mind when you hear somebody say, "I'll get back to you in a bit." Just how long is a bit? Go ahead and click on chat and all panelists. Tell us, how long is a bit? All right, we've got 10 minutes. Later in the day or next day, 5 minutes, about an hour, 2 minutes, 30 minutes. Somebody even put end of the day. So, my gosh, look how many different answers we have. And look how quickly those came up for seemingly so simple. By the way, nobody said a minute. Thank you.
No, but
even
I did. I expect it to be 60 seconds.
In an instant. What was that, Rob?
I said I expect it to be 60 seconds. That's my
judgment. Oh, I see, another point of view. So seemingly you would think all of us understand something this simple in the same way. Maybe not. This may be a case of assumption bias. We make assumptions that everyone thinks alike. Nuances of what or how someone thinks increases our ability to feel with that person, as we've talked about. So now what? How does this apply to you? Give this some consideration. We want you to think about how judgment may factor in your day-to-day. So be mindful of when you are being judgmental, then turn it around and open your mind. You can do that by pressing pause. Another way to do this is take it back to your team. Ask them this same question. I'll get back to you in a bit. Now, I'm going to ask you to be forgiving. Nobody's perfect. The goal here is to shift the balance towards dismantling judgment instead of keeping your walls or barriers up.
So as Eric mentioned, there's 5 steps towards building and applying empathy. And we've just scratched the surface around dismantling judgment. The next step is asking good questions, actively listening, that's that being present and hearing and taking everything in, integrating it into understanding, and use solution imagination. The second one that we're going to cover today, we're just moving progressively down the line, we're going to focus on ask good questions. So in our moderator role and wearing hats as insights professionals, we often hear people comment that, oh, it's not that difficult to ask people questions. The key, however, is not just asking questions. The key is to actually ask a good question. There's a very big difference between a good question and a bad question, as we are going to talk about. Often, people ask questions, they think they're asking a good question, but it's actually a leading question. As Eric mentioned, it's trying to affirm our biases or our worldview. As I was trying to wrap my head around this years ago, I would think about a courtroom drama when the lawyer stands up and shouts, "Objection, leading the witness," as an example of that. Leading questions give those not so subtle cues to the respondent or whoever you are talking to about what you want them to say. You're leading them towards a particular answer. And since we all end up having a desire to please, and that's pretty inherent for most of us, we'll eagerly say what we think people want to hear. Instead of a leading question, you want to ask what we call an essential question. Essential questions are broad. So what does it mean to be successful on the job? That is a very essential, it's a very broad question. A person could take that in any number of directions, and the answer would vary from person to person. But because you haven't led them towards a desired answer, it's going to get you what we call a quality answer. So essential questions lead you to a quality answer. A leading question is going to give you an unreliable answer. Is this really how they feel? Were they saying this to please me, to satisfy what I was trying to get out of them? Or are you asking an essential question where you can trust that the person that you're talking to came up with the answer, it's their answer, and it's how they actually think and feel? So no leading questions. You want to try to ask essential questions, and we'll talk about how to form those in a minute. I should say there are closed questions. So a closed question, the way I describe it, a closed question is something that you can really only answer with a yes or a no, possibly a maybe. It's closed. There's no other response than that. And yes, no questions do have their place, but not in an initial exploratory conversation that you might be having with somebody. So you need to be thinking about the context in which you're having the conversation, the type of question or conversation you're having, and the type of question to ask. So I don't want people to think they should never ask a yes-no question. There's just a time and a place for that. So we have a quick exercise. Which version of this question would you say is leading? Question 1, do you like an office with a door more than an open floor plan? Or question 2, what kind of office space do you prefer? Using chat to all panelists, just type in 1 if it's the leading question is, do you like an office with a door more than an open floor plan? Or if it's 2, what kind of office space do you prefer? Which one of these is leading? 1 on the left or 2 on the right?
Well, since I'm such a great person who asks leading questions, guess what, Rob? Most are saying number 1.
Number 1, exactly. You can't go. You're leading them. You're leading them to, yes, I like an office with a door more than an open floor plan, which I actually do, but that's not about me. But do you like an office with a door more than an open floor plan? It's a leading question. You're guiding them. You're telling them what to hear versus being completely open. What kind of office space do you prefer? The reality is that I actually like to work from home. So that's my ideal office space. And that might not be a question that the person that was posing the question, that's not the answer that they might have thought, but it can lead to some really interesting places and interesting direction. So a few tips for asking good questions. Again, I talked about closed questions that are those yes, nos. You want to keep the questions open. Helps you get more information. Do you like our new office space? Or what are which is a yes, no. And the answer better be yes. Or what are your thoughts about our new office space? Again, it's open. It could go any number of directions. You want to enter into a conversation in that open space. You want your judgment to be dismantled. So this is where the steps start to build and marry up. So you're open, there's no judgment going on, you're asking a good open question, and by being open and non-judgmental, you might be surprised how the dialogue changes and it takes you to a new place. But you've got to catch yourself. The judgment is that very first step, and it's what we all fall back on and drop down into when we're feeling uncomfortable, or some of us it's more of a reflex. You want to dismantle the judgment and then ask a good question, ask open questions. Another one is to remove the word why from your vocabulary. Of course, why is what we want to know, but when we ask why, it actually puts the other person on the defensive. And that is something, and I learned this when I was being trained to moderate years ago. The way they explained it to me and the way I talk about it, it goes all the way back to your childhood, when a parent or a caregiver may have said to you, why'd you draw on the wall in crayon? Why'd you cut your sister's hair? Why'd you throw your toy on the roof? Why? The result of that, it puts you on the defensive. You've done something wrong, and you know you might get punished afterward depending on the answer or what the action is that prompted the question. So as a kid, you might have just gone, I don't know. I don't know isn't going to work in the workplace, however. And yet, if you think about it, in the workplace, we still get challenged with why. Why was the report late? Why'd you leave work early? Why'd you skip the meeting? Again, it puts you on the defensive. And as I said, I don't know, isn't usually accepted as a response. But you, if you're being asked why and challenged with why, your feeling of defensiveness remains. So instead, try using other questioning words. Use who, what, where, when, how. Avoid putting the other person on the defensive that you're putting the question to. As a result, you'll find you'll get more open, honest answers, dialogue, and information. There's another example that we put up here. Why do you like a closed-door office? Just think about that question. Why do you like a closed-door office? You might actually start to feel a little touch of defensiveness. And you might be going to, oh, well, I like my privacy. I don't want people to see me all the time when I'm eating my lunch or hearing all of my phone calls. I like to talk to whomever, my bestie, in private. But how do you feel? So there's a defensiveness that's there. Why do you like a closed door office? Some of this is about the tone in which you're asking the question too. But how do you feel when the question is rephrased? What is it about a closed door office that you like? Just think about that question. What is it about a closed door office that you like? Now notice how you're feeling compared to when I was asking the why question to the what question. And notice how your thought goes to a different place. You might be more willing to help. You might be less defensive. You might be more open to elaborating on what it is about a closed door office that you like. The benefit of asking good questions, and it is so important, particularly in those initial exploratory kind of fact-finding conversations. You're going to find when you ask good questions, the conversation is going to open up to responses you wouldn't have received otherwise. And that deeper conversation improves understanding. You are able to get the point of view or the perspective of the other person, and that is all about cognitive empathy. And once you start to hear their perspective and then you integrate that into understanding, you get back to that Henry Ford quote, where you are seeing the other person's angle and can consider that as well as your own. If you don't ask good questions, you're really having, let's be honest, you're having a one-sided conversation, and that is not helping to build empathy. Here's another question. You guys are going to need to think for a second. You've been asked to interview a candidate for a job opening you have in your department, but there's not enough time for a full interview. We've all had those days. You can only ask one question. Which question do you ask? Think about an open, essential question. Which question do you ask? You've been asked to interview a candidate for a job opening you have in your department. There's not enough time for a full interview. You can only ask one question. Take a second, chat to all panelists what you would propose.
So here's some good questions, Rob. What makes you the best candidate for the position? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What got you interested in this role?
Nice. Good job, everybody. Good questions. So again, they're open. Nobody said why. Thank you. They're not closed questions. They're all open. They're essential, very broad. And that's going to lead to, in the time that you have for this quick interview, you're going to have a good conversation. You're going to get to really get a sense of who that person is and hear their perspective and hopefully get their point of view. So now what? How to apply this second step? Just give this some consideration. Something to do while you're on your way home, commuting, those quiet moments, washing the dishes, taking a shower, mowing the lawn. How do you ask questions? What type of questions do you tend to ask? Are they leading? Are they essential? Are they closed or open? Challenge yourself to eliminate the word why for just one day. This was so difficult for me when I first started to do it. I became aware. Once you kind of plug into it, you're like, oh goodness, I use the word why all the time. It's coming up here or there. And stop yourself, catch yourself, try to use those other words, the who's, the what's, the where's, the how's, and try to rephrase your question and see how the answer is different. The answer, the tone of the conversation. This is another great exercise to take back to your team or some of your colleagues and give them that why challenge. You might actually have fun with it. You could do a little quarter jar for every time you hear somebody use the word why and challenge them to do it differently.
Well, as you're starting to see, the struggle is real, folks. Let's help you get back into shape with your empathy muscle. You've taken a huge first step as we coach and train you to go from maybe not so firm to firm.
And so to that, as Eric had mentioned, when we started at the beginning of this year, we added to our offerings to help improve people's ability to connect and relate to each other at work in order to improve their effectiveness, their efficiency, the bottom line. And we call that Solution Empathy Camp. It's a series of training workshops designed to teach people how to build and apply empathy in work situations like we've been talking about, particularly around critical thinking, problem solving, insight development, innovation, and more. And the more comes from the fact that it's customized to meet the needs of a team or the organization. So every session is designed to meet the specific needs of the group that's participating. And we follow a learn, practice, apply training approach that includes direct engagement with other real human beings from outside of your work group to develop and apply practical skills. One of the solutions that we offer is called Day Camp. So again, built around learn, practice, and apply. You learn why empathy and more detail on the 5 steps. We go into a lot more than what we've been able to share here today in our limited time. You get to practice. It's building greater empathy. Again, we use customers or consumers in the workshop so you can practice safely. They're strangers coming in that you can connect to and relate with. And then you start to apply it to work and make it real. Day Camp itself is a 7-hour session. It's on or off site. It's small class style, 12 to 15 people. And we utilize a pre-survey to evaluate skill level and areas of focus that meet the needs of the class and the organization. So before we close, I want to return to that first question that we asked you, and we do have Q&A coming up as we have a few minutes left. But first, I want to return to that first question that we asked. Again, use the chat feature, and would you just send us the first thing that now comes into your mind in answer to this question? What's the situation or problem that empathy could help solve in your workplace? First thing that comes to mind. I know we've given you a lot. Want to understand situation or problem that empathy could help to solve in your workplace.
Well, one that we have, Rob, is managing employees.
Yes, empathy is huge, and you're hearing a lot about empathic leadership and the importance of that as people are developing their career path.
And almost to go along with that, how to understand how people are feeling about management.
Because empathy is a two-way street.
Right, and some other areas are around inclusion, diversity, retention.
Excellent. Thank you. We've got a Q&A coming up, but Eric, you want to take us through a couple of next steps?
So where can you go from here? You know, obviously you're all thinking about some of the ways that empathy can make a really big difference in how you are being able to understand folks. So first, help us improve. Take our 5-minute post-webinar survey to tell us what you think and ask us other questions. You'll be receiving a link to that survey shortly after our time together here today.
Yes, so if I can, Eric, because if I could ask, I'd really appreciate people taking the time to fill out the survey. I believe it will come to you via email, but you can also, when you close out and leave this webinar, don't close your screen, the browser tab, and I think the survey might show up there as well. But if it doesn't, you will definitely be getting it via email. And really appreciate and thank you in advance for filling that out.
Great. Thanks, Rob. You can find out more by emailing us at hello@ignite360.com. And then check us out and follow us on social media. Now it's your turn. We may have gone a little longer than we anticipated, but that's okay. We still have time for questions and Q&A. What questions might you have? We want to hear from you. Feel free to click chat and then all panelists.
We've got about 5 minutes.
So Rob, one question that's come up, what can I do to keep empathy top of mind on a daily basis?
On a daily basis? Oh, great question. It's practicing. Practice makes perfect, and admitting that you're human and recognizing that and giving yourself permission. The first step that we find people really have their kind of aha moment with is around judgment, and it can be in slightly more say extreme, I use that loosely, but in a bigger term where somebody is faced with an uncomfortable situation, and that's where judgment really pops up, and you can really see it. But it also occurs in smaller moments throughout your day, in the way that you're interacting with somebody, maybe in the way that you're interacting with the driver that almost cut you off, or that isn't driving fast enough, or doing whatever, it's checking in with yourself. Am I having judgment? And how do I dismantle that judgment? How do I drop the wall and open myself up? That's the first thing. And then going into the other steps and asking good questions and trying always to see the perspective of the other person. Am I able to see their point of view? Another good tip is to actually, when you're having a conversation with somebody, say to them, they've made their situation, they've stated their perspective, their point of view. Start your reply with, I see your point of view, and use some of their words back. It's really difficult to do that and not actually have empathy. So by saying, oh, I see your point of view, you feel that, and you explain what that is, using their words back, And then that gives you an opening to share your point of view or work with them to find a solution or make a decision based on both of your perspectives. So again, it's all coming back to that Henry Ford quote about seeing the other person's angle as well as your own and utilizing those together.
And Rob, if I could build on that, another way might be to also recognize how often you're using the word I. And if you catch yourself using the word I, ask a question. That can almost be sort of like, oh, I said I, let me ask a question first to be able to learn more about what's around you, who's around you. So another great sort of press pause. Another question we have, Rob, is how can we use media to teach people empathy?
How can we, that's a really great question. Documentary is actually a really, I'm not sure how the first thing that is coming to my mind, documentary. Sitting down and watching people's stories about whatever situation they're going through. It can be far afield, but even when you can find things that are homegrown in the United States, that's when it's particularly affecting, I find. So seeking out real, true documentaries, don't have a political slant to them. Obviously, every documentary is going to have a point of view of the filmmaker, but finding and connecting with and trying to make sure, as you're going into it, that your judgment is dismantled. And then actually listening and trying to see their point of view. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. And I think that's one of the things I hear from people they're afraid of about empathy is, well, if I have empathy, does that mean that I'm agreeing with them and I don't actually believe that way? No, that's not what it means. It's about just being able to see their point of view and understand, okay, I understand you feel this way. This is what's important to you. So I would say documentary. I would go to social media. And think about the way that you might be engaging with your world in social media. Are you a quick to judge individual, or is there a way to drop some of the judgment and offer more support or to try to connect with people? And that, it's kind of like a fight of a bunch of pit bulls in a ring sometimes on social media, depending on the topic, but you can start to lay out and present your point of view. And be comfortable that not everybody's going to get it right away. And that's okay. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but you want them to just hear your point of view and you hear theirs. Don't forget, you've got to be listening as well. Any other?
And you received a thank you for that, Rob.
Oh, thank you. So last thing I'm going to leave you guys with, really appreciate you sticking with us for the full hour. As you are going forth, please bring awareness to how you're taking in your surroundings. Aspire to be like this woman. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to being in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Hopefully talk to you soon.
Yes.